Recently, there was an article shared about snakes with legs. And when this was posted on Facebook, there are some people who are saying maybe that was a different creature, and other people who are saying basically they seem to be just going along with the idea that these snakes had legs. Now, I'm not, this is amongst people who believe in God, by the way. I'm not speaking about atheists versus theists here. But what I want to speak about is vestigial organs, right? So, if we accept the idea that they are vestigial organs, is that problematic for design? So before we speak about vestigial organs, I just want to share a few thoughts about design, which I've mentioned before, but just very briefly because it's very important for this conversation. Design is based upon design specification. So for someone to say something is a bad design or good design, you have to have a design specification, and then you have to challenge according to that. Now, when Darwinists say imperfect design, they're using a design specification, which is that our organs, our anatomy, our linguistics, all of our biochemical traits, everything fundamentally should be adaptive. Now, I'm not saying they say it is adaptive, but any deviation from adaptation for them is sign that this is a vestigial organ or a bad design or a byproduct or whatever. So for us as believers in God, we don't accept that necessarily, right? I mean, theism is very broad, but I'm just speaking about Abrahamic theism here, right? We don't accept just this idea that every single one of our traits, we should assume that it's there for your survival and reproduction. Because the thing is, the way imperfect design, the argument's been used against God, is actually circular reasoning. They assume a certain standard, which is that things should be there for survival and reproductivity, and since they've deviated from that, therefore bad design. But they've already, you see, they've made an assumption in the beginning, and then that's leading to a certain conclusion. But that particular assumption, it doesn't necessarily lead to the conclusion. And the reason is that assumption is not really accepted by all theists. In fact, the majority of theists, I would argue, they do not accept this assumption that everything should be optimally designed for survival and reproduction. So, designs as an argument against God is a very, the bad design argument is a very bad argument, right? Because it's assuming the Darwinian paradigm to be true, then saying, hey, look, some things have deviated from the optimal adaptive potentiality, and therefore this is bad design, and that makes sense because Darwinism's true. So it's a very vicious sort of circle sort of reasoning going on, circular reasoning going on. Darwinism is assumed at the beginning and is concluded at the end, right? What we need to understand is that bad design is based upon the idea of a particular specification. Now, what we can argue is that vestigial organs, in of themselves, the concept of them, we can actually argue about them in two particular ways. One is accepting them, one is rejecting them. What do I mean by that? Well, consider junk DNA. Junk DNA was once considered to be junk, and that was a vestigial remnant of our evolutionary past, and that was used as an argument against God. In fact, Philip Kitcher, philosopher, he said, if we were designed, then, you know, he basically ridiculed God. Then God needs to go back to school. That's what he said, right? Very vicious atheist. Anyway, to his surprise, well, I don't know if he was surprised. I don't even know if he's up to date. But to the surprise of the people who come up with nonsense like that, junk DNA was found to be functional, right? Largely functional. So that vestigial remnant was not actually vestigial from the perspective of survival and reproduction. It actually did have a function. However, what if they are vestigial organs? I mean, of course, science can always revise its conclusions, but let's just say, do we have a problem theologically with the idea of vestigial organs? No, we actually don't. If they are, and I've actually seen some, I saw this in a documentary, David Attenborough, good stuff. So he was speaking about, there was these fish who they could see in their past, but then they moved to an area where they no longer needed to actually use their eyesight because they were in a dark area, and they could just survive using their senses and stuff. So their eyes became vestigial. Their eyes, stopped working. So we don't have a problem with that necessarily, because that's use and disuse. If you use it, you keep it. If you don't use it, you lose it. It's not really a problem. It's only a problem when people, they have this perfectionist idea, and then they're like, it's away from the perfectionist idea, therefore there's no God, therefore it's bad design. That's really pathetic, because where do you end this, right? Where do you end this? You can look at the human body and say, wow, look at this, this looks designed, that looks designed from natural selection point of view, from their perspective. And then they look at certain organs and say, well, these are vestigial because we used them in the past and we sort of have remnants of them left. Therefore, there's no God. That's just poor reasoning, right? It just shows that there was some things that we were using in the past and we no longer use them. Now, how do we actually agree with that? Because even with the coccyx, with the appendix, there's the idea that they were vestigial, but then later on we discovered they did have some functionality. So even if we were to hypothetically accept that argument, the argument for these vestigial organs, it doesn't mean there's no God. And the other thing is, look, this idea of perfection, right? So zebras are badly designed because a good design would have been if their legs were actually mechanically able to turn into machine guns and shoot at lions that are going to come to eat them. Where are you going to stop this idea of perfection? You could say, why don't I have bulletproof skin? You could also say, actually, human sexuality, human reproductivity is very confused from a Darwinian perspective. I saw a recent article that what's his name? One of these biologists from Stanford, evolutionary psychologists from Stanford, about human sexuality, that we are, basically, long story short, we're very complicated. Even if you look at the way people get married, what do? They go out there, find a partner, have to buy her a ring, do this, do that. It's all this stuff. Bacteria reproduces just like that. It just keeps reproducing, right? So you could argue from that perspective, bacteria are fitter than us, which makes sense. And then therefore, human marriage is proof against design, because we have marriages going on when in reality, the best way of reproducing would have been asexual reproduction. So this idea will not end, this idea that there's bad design, but that idea will not end, not because it's a good idea, but because it's a bad argument. Because it's making presuppositions and then concluding using those presuppositions as if those presuppositions are not there. But they're always there. Look, guys, design can be understood in many different ways, and design is something which is based on a design specification. So what we both agree, this is quite interesting, what we both agree, the Darwinists and the theists, we both agree there's design. They say natural selection, we say God. We both agree that there's a huge controversy about the origin of these biological organisms, the novel body plans. And, well, okay, I say controversy, and then some Darwinists on this channel are going to be like, no, there's no controversy. You guys need to grow up, right? Go read the literature. Darwinists themselves do recognize there is a controversy. And I'm not talking about Darwinists like Richard Dawkins, right? The journalist. I'm actually talking about the actual people studying this problem at an in-depth level. People like, James Shapiro and others, right? Although he's not really a Darwinian. But, okay, you guys get my point. It's like the Royal Society. If you look up the proceedings of the Royal Society 2016, when they were discussing this idea, Darwinists do recognize, the sincere ones, the ones who are open about this, they do recognize there is issues. So we both agree design's there. They say natural selection, we say God. All right. Now, if I was to straw man the Darwinists and say Darwinism is nonsense because natural selection should produce organisms which are really, really good at art, and really moral organisms which are very, very kind. That's what natural selection should do. Since we don't see that in the world, natural selection, Darwinism is nonsense. Now, a Darwinist would rightly point out, you're talking nonsense, because that's not the idea of that's not the way that Darwinism works. It's not about artistry. It's not about creating beings, sentient beings, which are great moral role models. No, nature is red in tooth and claw, and, we have a completely different Darwinian sort of paradigm. So if you guys aren't going to accept my poor argument based upon me making erroneous assumptions about Darwinism, then how do you expect me or any theist to accept the idea of bad design based upon your erroneous understanding of what a God would have done? Because now what you're doing is that when you say, well, if I was God, you're not God. That's the point. You're not God. So, this whole argument that if I was God, I wouldn't have done that. Well, I heard this really stupid argument. It was actually, I've forgotten her name, but it's Aaron Ra and his missus, who looks, Vietnamese, Chinese, I'm not, I think she's Vietnamese. Anyway, her and him, they were at this talk, it's on his channel, and it's about her becoming an atheist and stuff. And her argument is, well, why couldn't we be designed to have make our own food like plants do, right? Like these plants. That's a pathetic argument. You're going by this hyper vegan narrative that it's bad that we're eating other organisms. If only we could make our own food. And since we can't, that shows that, basically it's bad design or something. No, that's just a poor argument. So in summary, vestigial organs can be explained within theism without any issue. And sometimes those vestigial organs do not turn out to be vestigial. And it's the starting assumptions which color the person's view of design. And those starting assumptions from a theistic point of view, from an Islamic point of view, we have a theology which doesn't restrict things to Allah. God has made everything optimal for survival and reproduction, and therefore there's a deviation from that, therefore it's bad design. No, like I mentioned previously in another video, Islam has a very nuanced idea of creation. So God even links the fact that some people have children and some people are barren. He links that to himself and to the fact that this life is a test and that we will be tested by good and evil. And also, sadly, will be tested by the stupidity of Darwinists as well. But that's something that we can have a bit of patience on, and we can have that patience through humor, through ridicule, and through enlightening them. Enlightening them? Through showing them the right path and showing them an alternative to the nonsense that they're actually stuck in. And that's what makes it a lot more bearable. The fact that, one, I like the reaction of Darwinists when you criticize them, when you mock them. I just love it. And I love to see them triggered. And I'm here not speaking about the confused, sincere atheists. I'm speaking about the militant type atheism that we have in the world today. And, some people, they may see the way that I speak to them in Speaker's Corner, in debates, in other settings, as rude. Look, you guys have to understand, right? If you take a nice Darwinist, a nice academic like Michael Roos, I would never speak to him like that. If you take a militant Darwinist like Dawkins, who uses poor arguments, which people like Roos criticize, then of course my attitude to him is going to be totally different. But funnily enough, from a Darwinian point of view, since nature is red in tooth and claw, you shouldn't really have a problem with the aggressive debunking of Darwinism that you will get on this fantastic channel. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your thoughts.